So here you are, standing in the lab with 3 Pokeballs in front of you. Each one holds an all-new, completely unique, and most likely powerful Pokemon. You'll pick one of these, your starter Pokemon, and your journey will begin. But wait, which one should you pick? They're all good in their own right, but which one will get you the farthest? A lot of Poketubers before me have tried to answer this one, but each video I've seen has had more or less flawed rankings, whether that be due to time constraints, a lack of research and/or game knowledge, or not accounting for certain challenges. And while I can't cover everything in this video, I'll do my best to provide the definitive answer. Before we start though, a quick reminder to subscribe if you end up enjoying this video. It's free, and in return you get quality Pokemon content. Subscribing, as we all know, also makes you 54% more attractive. Don't quote me on that. With that out of the way, let's start with Generation 1. Pokemon Red, Green, Blue, and Yellow on the Game Boy. So let's get the obvious thing out of the way first. Despite what Game Freak seems to think, Charmander is potentially the worst pick in the Generation 1 games. While yes, it beats common types such as Grass, Bug, and... no, actually that's it. That's all it hits super effectively. Steel types didn't exist yet, making Fire less useful offensively, Ice types were few and far between, and often paired with Water, and it couldn't even take advantage of its Flying type stab, same type attack bonus, which boosts Pokemon's moves of the same type by 1.5 times damage, since it didn't get a Flying move yet. Nope, no Wing attack, Fly, none of that. Alongside this, it struggled against early gym leaders. It couldn't hit Brock's Pokemon even neutrally, and was weak to the fast, strong Starmie that Misty had. It's not particularly outstanding against Surge, Koga, Sabrina, and once again underperforms against Blaine and Giovanni, but at least it can beat Erica, even though you'll probably have a different Fire Flying type by then. There are just better options in Red and Blue than Charizard, and it prevents you from getting one of the other two. Despite what some might think, Charizard also performs in competitive Pokemon. For a bit of context for any viewers unfamiliar with competitive Pokemon, each generation is named by an abbreviation of its game's titles, so we're talking about RBY, and Overused, more commonly called OU, is the tier of standard play. In RBY OU, Charizard is outclassed in almost every way by the still inconsistent Moltres. Lacking the legendary Pokemon's higher special stat and access to agility, all Charizard can do is set up Sword Stance and hope it doesn't get KO'd by one of its many weaknesses from powerful tier staples like Starmie, Slowbro, and Cloyster, hit by a Thunder Wave to have its speed, or just be dropped from the team overall in favor of better Sword Stance users such as Kingler and Sandslash. Golem and Rhydon are also very prevalent Pokemon in Generation 1 OU, which is just another nail in the coffin. So having no real use in OU, it dropped to Underused, or UU, the tier below standard play. There it was defined by its Sword Stance set, potentially being very dangerous with its near unresisted coverage in Earthquake and Body Slam. It threatened a lot of the tier, including grass types like Victreebel and Tangela, and potentially beat Wrap Tentacruel, which was threatening because, instead of trapping you, Wrap in Gen 1 stops the target from moving while it attacks for 2 to 5 turns, and can potentially stun lock Pokemon that outspeeds. However, due to its many weaknesses and popular types in the tier, Charizard was more frail than you expect, and was completely walled by Dragonite using Agility and Wrap. It's still ruined by Thunder Wave, and even though it can sometimes beat Tentacruel, it just goes down to Surf if it isn't set up. Overall, Charizard is probably the weakest of the canon starters, which is sad considering how cool it was. Next up is Squirtle, the adorable water-type turtle that, unlike Charmander, can beat Brock. However, it tends to struggle against the fairly common grass types around the region, though that's really its only weakness. Defensively, it's pretty good, with a defense of 100 and special of 85, its special defense in later generations was 105, and its attack stat is decent. Its speed is middling, however, and the lineup of gyms means that, even though you'll be sweeping through caves, it won't be seeing much use against Misty, Surge, Erica, Sabrina, and likely Koga. It does excellently into Blaine and Giovanni, and beats a majority of Lance's team, could wall some of Lorelei's Pokemon, and beats Bruno's Onix, but Kanto is packed with great water types like Tentacruel, Poliwrath, Starmie, and even Vaporeon. If you choose to forego Blastoise in favor of a different starter, you likely won't be missing out for long. At first glance, Blastoise is arguably the worst of the 3 in competitive, seeing almost no usage at all in OU. It's even outclassed by Vaporeon and Poliwrath in UU, lacking tools and stats the other two don't have, and being reduced to a niche as a mixed tank. So Blastoise dropped to Never Use, or NU, the lowest tier in RBY, and there it was incredible. Being able to check many tier threats and having great bulk, Blastoise is one of the most centralizing Pokemon in RBY NU, and though its speed led to it struggling a bit against fast attackers like Mr. Mime or Electrode, it ate up Fire Spins from Ninetales and Charizard and fired back on a miss with a powerful Surf. It had Rest for Recovery, Body Slam or Toxic, depending on which you preferred, and strong Ice moves to potentially freeze an important Pokemon, which in Gen 1 lasted until the Pokemon was either KO'd or was hit by any Fire-type move except Fire Spin, making it basically a one-hit KO. Overall, while the higher tiers didn't suit it, Blastoise was a very solid Pokemon in RBY and U. Finally, it's time to talk about the starter that I believe to be the best option in Generation 1. Each of the 3 have different and sometimes better options to pick up through the game, but the one with the least competition was Venusaur. True, Oddish and Bellsprout shared its type and many moves, but Venusaur simply had better stats and didn't require a stone to evolve. It got Razor Leaf, a move that, due to a glitch, almost always crit in Gen 1, Growth, a move that raised the special stat as opposed to both attacking stats, basically being a grass-type Calm Mind, which wasn't super useful since in Generation 1, crits also bypassed your stat boosts. and Sleep Powder, which was very strong in Gen 1 because of Sleep's busted mechanics back then. It beats a lot of the water types in the game, also shreds through Brock and rock types in caves, and beats Misty, resists Surge's attacks, and can sit in the back while other Pokemon, which you'll have more options for by this point in the game, beat the rest of the gyms. It comes back in the Elite Four to beat Bruno's Onix, and can even potentially set up and sweep in fights all throughout the run with Sleep Powder. Venusaur is a very strong Kanto Pokemon, and the starter I pick every time I play through Kanto, which for some reason happens to be a lot. In competitive, Venusaur is, once again, underwhelming. It's outclassed by Victreebel and OU, an already mediocre Pokemon, but while it lacks Victreebel's wrap and higher attack, it's faster and physically bulkier, and can be used as a Sword Stance Sweeper if needed. Its speed lets it tear through most Pokemon with Grit Razor Leafs and Sword Stance boosted Hyper Beams, which didn't require a turn to recharge if you got KO with it in Gen 1, making it a really good move, and was one of the most consistent answers to Slowbro. However, its one glaring flaw is its deceptively bad typing. While nowadays, Grass Poison is a great defensive typing, especially on Amoonguss, back in Gen 1, Psychic types ruled the metagame, behind the normal types of course, and Blizzard, being only 90% accurate instead of 70%, was much more widespread and therefore a big threat. Thus, Venusaur didn't really see much usage in either OU or UU until Victreebel, its only main competition, left UU for OU, leaving some shoes that Venusaur was happy to fill. It became a strong metagame presence with a fast, reliable Sleep move, which, as previously mentioned, was incredibly powerful in RBY. Despite having a lower speed tier than many strong Pokemon, it outsped Pokemons like Vaporeon and Hypno and Speed-Type Dragonite, and thrives in these matchups. However, it's still held back by its typing, leading to it having trouble switching in and holding it back from its full potential as an amazing sleeper and sweeper. So we finally finished Red, Blue, and Green, which I didn't expect to take this long, but now it's time to rank each starter based on their viability. I'll do this separately since this video is mostly focused on their actual in-game uses, with a bit of competitive trivia for fun. In terms of gameplay, Charizard gets a 5 out of 10, for not matching up against many major fights and having other fire types accessible. Its true replacement Moltres isn't really possible to obtain before Victory Road, and its typing lets it hit common Pokemon well, despite its lack of flying coverage. In terms of competitive use, it ranks a little higher at 7 out of 10. It has a certain niche in OU and is solid in UU, but has definite flaws that hold it back, and you'd really rather use another Pokemon in its place. Blastoise gets a solid 7 out of 10. Not a bad water type at all, but most of what it can do can be achieved by better waters than Venusaur. In competitive though, it's an easy 9 out of 10, missing out on that perfect 10 because, while dominating NU is great, it's nowhere near being viable in OU. Its bulk and power are both amazing, and it's one of the most threatening and centralized forces in RBY NU. So if you want to use a starter in competitive RBY, play NU, I guess. Venusaur being the best pick for your average playthrough gets a 10 out of 10 being our first perfect score. Its synergy with all the other Pokemon you'll get is incredible, it gets amazing moves, and it beats a lot of early game fights. Especially if you're playing a Nuzlocke, pick Venusaur because you have so many other options for water types, and while they're fun, you don't really need a fire type in Kanto. Finally, in competitive, Venusaur gets a 5 out of 10. Its typing just holds it back too much, Victreebel outclasses it whenever it's around, and while it has great stuff like Fast Sleep Powder, Razor Leaf, and Sword Stance, it just doesn't have the usage to back it up. One last thing to mention about Gen 1 real quick. No, I didn't forget about Yellow, but since the only available starter in that game is Pikachu, the choice is pretty obvious. Comment down below if you want to hear me talk about competitive Pikachu, because that'd be pretty fun. Now we can move on to Gen 2, Gold, Silver, and Crystal, and spoilers, Chikorita is the worst option you could possibly pick. Meganium is a primarily defensive Pokemon with average attacking stats, and while it does get moves like Poison Powder, Synthesis, and Screens by level up, Pure Grass is not a good defensive typing. Before its immunity to powder moves, Grass assisted Water, Electric, Grass, and Ground, and while those are nice, it was weak to common Bug, Flying, and Poison types, along with having big weaknesses to Fire and Ice. Along with common weaknesses in the rest of the game, this made it bad against the first two gyms, Morty because of all his Pokemon having secondary poison types, Jasmine, Claire, and just neutral into Chuck and Whitney, while there were other options that were easier to access. And while it was super effective into Price's team, it simply didn't have the power to knock out his Pokemon before they fired back with their Ice type attacks. Its resists just weren't common enough in the region to be very useful, and it wasn't good at all into the league either. The only Pokemon it matched up remotely well against in Will's team is Slowbro. Koga and Karen can just wallow with most of their Pokemon, and while it can beat Bruno's Onix, you're probably not going to be too pressed for options there. Against Birdkeeper Lance, it obviously does poorly, and while it does well in Kanto against Brock and Misty, it doesn't have enough to do there to merit its late game usage. Overall, Meganium could have been a decent Pokemon, but being in Johto makes it an absolutely awful pick for Gold, Silver, and Crystal. Surprisingly, in GSC OU, Meganium had a solid niche, despite technically not being a part of the tier. Meganium was part of the underused ban list, or UUBL for short, meaning that it was too strong for OU, but didn't see quite enough usage for OU. That being said though, while in-game it may have struggled with so many of its weaknesses and so few of its resistances around, the OU metagame suited our Leafy Dino friend quite well. Its popular sets were one using Razor Leaf, Leech Seed, Synthesis, and either one of Reflect or Light Screen, depending on what you needed. And the set was used to support the team and check threats that would prevent setup or take out key members. Surprisingly though, Meganium could also harness the power of the RBY grass types to use a Sword Stance set. And along with Body Slime's Paralyzed chance, Earthquake's sheer power, and Synthesis to keep it alive, Meganium could be deceptively dangerous to certain tier threats. True, it needed support, and needed Skarmory and Zapdos out of the way before it could really get rolling, but its presence in the tier was respectable, at least compared to how it performed in-game. Next up is Cyndaquil, whose evolutionary line has the same exact stat spread the Charizard line has. Game Freak, showing favoritism since 1999. This wasn't bad for Typhlosion though. Far from it in fact, since its good speed and special attack, along with a great offensive typing, let it beat a lot of gyms, being effective alongside Mareep and Geodude against Falkner, beating Bugsy, Jasmine, and matching up well against Price, and it beat common bug and grass types along with beating a lot of Pokemon neutral to it. None of the Johto starters were the best ever in GSC, but Typhlosion has some great power. It's pretty good in the league too, beating Koga's team, a couple Will's Pokemon, and getting Thunder Punch for Lance, and then mostly staying in the back for Kanto, although it does well against Erika. Being too strong for the UU tier once again, Typhlosion ever only saw usage in OU. However, it had far too many flaws and other fire types outclassed it. Let's start with its moveset. It ran Fire Blast for big stab damage, either Hidden Power Grass or Thunder Punch for water types, Dynamic Punch in spite of its accuracy of 50 to threaten Tyranitar and be a nuisance to Snorlax, and either Earthquake or Sunny Day depending on if it needed coverage or was a Sun Sweeper. Its advantages over Charizard and Moltres were its electric neutrality and a lack of 4x weakness to Rock, letting it take on Zapdos, but it was outclassed in almost every way by these and other fires. Moltres has a better special attack stat, Charizard has Belly Drum and new Flying Stab, Houndoom has a dark typing, and even Entei has better bulk. Houndoom and Entei also have Solar Beam, a great move for fire types to have under Sun, and overall, Typhlosion just didn't have the right conditions to find any sort of real niche in its debut generation's OU. Finally, Totodile was the water-type starter of the Johto games, and its final evolution, Feraligatr, was in a bit of an unfortunate spot. Its main issue is that its attack stat was much higher than its special attack, sitting at 105 while the latter was much lower at 79, but every water-type move is special before Gen 4's physical special split. Its level-up moveset wasn't great either, with the best moves it got being Slash and Hydro Pump, and while it got stuff like Dig, Earthquake, and Iron Tail by TM, it just didn't have the freedom in its moveset to really do much. It was neutral into the first 5 gyms, weak to Jasmine's Magnanimity, although it overall was pretty good against her team with the coverage I mentioned, didn't do great into Price's Pokemon, and didn't match up well against Claire or Lance without the special ice moves that other Pokemon can make better use of. Against Will, it fell short against its Exeggutor, and was overall neutral against most of the league's Pokemon in general. Sure, he beat Brock and Blaine and Kanto, but Feraligatr is just so frustratingly average that there's really no point to pick it over Typhlosion. Johto is a bit lacking in water types, true, but you still have options like the much stronger and part-flying Gyarados, or again, Tentacruel. Physically, it's strong and can take a few hits, but in the end, it can't really stand up to the other options GSC have to offer. Feraligatr fell the lowest of the 3 starters in competitive GSC, ending up in NUBL. In OU, it has some theoretically good sets as a Skarmory counter, Skarmory being the popular defensive pairing of Skarmory and Blissey, but it just doesn't have the stats beyond attack to back it up. Lacking physical stab, all Feraligatr can really do is run Hydro Pump, Earthquake, a Rock-type move, and whatever else it needs to just do anything. It doesn't even see much serious play in UU either, using either a Rest/Sleep Talk set or Roar along with whatever strong moves it can scrape together to try and make an impact and not be outclassed by Blastoise, Gyarados, Quagsire, or even Quillfish. Overall, it's safe to say that Feraligatr rarely, if ever, sees usage in serious GSC competitive play. So it's time for the rankings. Chikorita gets a 0 out of 10 in terms of in-game usage, being one of the few starter Pokemon ever to actually be a detriment to your team. If you ever try to Nuzlocke a Johto game with Chikorita, props to you because that's one heck of a challenge. Competitively though, Meganium gets a solid 7 out of 10 for having real niches and for making me feel bad for it because of its awful use in-game. Cyndaquil gets a nice 7 out of 10 in terms of in-game usage, probably being the best option as it beats a lot of important Pokemon with its Fire Stab, good speed, and coverage. The fact it's only a 7 and is the best option for a playthrough is pretty sad though. In the competitive aspect, it gets a 3 out of 10, being outclassed in many regards by a bunch of other fire types, and while it definitely has things to set it apart from them, it's just not on the level of an actual OU Pokemon. Feraligatr gets a 5.5 out of 10, just higher than half, because as a strong water type, you can definitely make a case for picking it over Typhlosion if you really want to. However, its stats in conjunction with its specially offensive typing bring it down, alongside its moveset being disappointing. In competitive, it gets a 0 out of 10 with no reason to ever use it. Never use Feraligatr in serious Gen 2 play because it'll only bring down your team. Finally, for this video, we'll be moving on to Gen 3 with Ruby, Sapphire, and Emerald, or RSE. First is the Grass-type starter Trico, who has some pretty good uses. Right out the gate, it beats the first gym, being Roxanne's Rock-type gym, and then has some uses later against Watson, Hayden Liza, and the Water-type gym. It's also pretty useful against Champion Wallace and Emerald. In Hoenn, a region so filled with water and water types, it's also a useful Pokemon to have, and it favors special attacks while using a special type, that being Grass, and has a very nice speed stat of 120. However, despite these great aspects, Sceptile has a few big drawbacks. First, while Hoenn has quite a few grass-weak Pokemon, grass types aren't exactly hard to find. With options like Shiftry, Ludicolo, Vileplume, and Breloom, it's not super likely you'll be pressed for options. You're also able to get either an Abra or a Ralts fairly early on, and while it's less plausible in a Nuzlocke, you can still end up with one of these strong special attackers wielding Shockwave after the 3rd gym. Heck, right after the normal gym, you can catch an Electrode and or Magneton and new Malvo, which are arguably better alternatives to Grass when you have a water type on your team, which will be very likely due to Hoenn's aforementioned abundance. Sceptile isn't a bad Pokemon to have by any means, but its alternatives just have some advantages over it that we'll discuss in a minute. Sceptile in competitive RSC has some interesting sets despite being UUBL. Generation 3 OU is highly regarded as one of the most enjoyable and popular competitive metagames of all time, at least in singles. Being called Advanced OU, or ADV for short, because of all the Gen 3 games being on the Game Boy Advance, it has a very dynamic and constantly evolving metagame that we'll be talking about quite a bit here. Sceptile in Advance has some interesting sets despite being UUBL. Its first and most prevalent is one of the most annoying stall Pokemon in the entire game, with Leaf Blade, Leech Seed, Substitute, and either Hidden Power, Fire, or Ice. By using Leech Seed and setting up a Substitute, it's able to avoid damage while healing up easily and absolutely walling Blissey. It can decimate Skarmory and Salamence with the likes of Hidden Power, and the set becomes even more effective with a layer of Spikes down, forcing an opponent to either switch and take damage from them, or stay in and take damage from Leech Seed. Another one of its sets using Substitute utilizes Endeavor and the Pitaya Berry, boosting its special attack at low HP and letting it bring down Blissey very low with Endeavor. It has a few other uses with Sword Stance, or some other mixed attacker options, but due to its typing and how many Pokemon can be used to check it, it's best relegated to its Subseed set. Torchic is a pretty powerful option in Ruby, Sapphire, and Emerald. With an attack stat of 120 and its special attack not being far behind at 110, it makes up well for its lackluster speed, one of the most important aspects an in-game Pokemon can have. It's one of the most effective mixed attackers in the game. Upon evolving into Kabuskin at level 16, it gains the Fighting type and the move Double Kick, letting it beat Roxanne if you're not using level caps, that is. And it also does good damage to Brawly with Peck, can beat Watson's Magneton thanks to his Fighting Stab, and does well against Norman. After that, it kind of falls off in terms of usage against gyms, but by then you'll have other great options to beat important fights with. It beats Sydney, Glacia, and some of Steven's Pokemon, though letting it be a great asset in the league. One of its most important aspects ever is that it gets to move Bulk Up at level 28. Bulk Up boosts the user's attack and defense by one stage each, and can be used to destroy certain fights with a bit of setup. It's one of the most powerful options you can get, especially in a Nuzlocke, and raises Blaziken up quite a bit. Hoenn has no shortage of fighting types, with Brolin once again being a great option, Hariyama being surprisingly versatile, and Medicham and Machoke being nothing to sneeze at, and while Magcargo, Camerupt, and Torkoal aren't the best, Hoenn isn't even the best place to have a fire type. Sure, it's a great offensive and defensive type, but while Blaziken is an incredibly resourceful and useful Pokemon, none of its advantages come from its primary typing. Blaziken is just as versatile on Advanced OU as it is in-game, with one of its best sets being a mixed sweeper set. Despite being UUBL once again and having checks such as Gyarados and Salamence, both with Intimidate to lower its attack, it makes use of good predictions, Sword Stance or Focus Punch, and a mixture of physical and special stab to check powerful threats on opposing teams. Other sets use Select Berry boosting its speed when it gets into Blaze range to help get it some KOs, and Hidden Power Grass or Ice to check both Swampert and Salamence respectively. It's defensively bad typing and poor speed will hold it back though, with it being weak to 4 of the most common strong moves in the tier, those being Surf, Earthquake, Psychic, and Hidden Power Flying. While Blaziken does have flaws though, there's no denying the roles it can play are powerful and shouldn't be ignored. Our third and final starter in RSE is Mudkip, a water type beloved by many Pokemon fans, and for very good reason. This is one of the best starter Pokemon in the series history, beating Roxanne, decimating Watson by the time it evolves and gains the ground type, and matching up well against Flannery, Winona, with support from moves like Ice Beam, and Tate and Liza. In the league, its strength helps it beat a lot of Pokemon and matches well with a lot of powerful Pokemon you can add to your team, such as Swellow, Hariyama, and Magneton. Its great bulk, attack, and not bad special attack go well with its great offensive and defensive typing, letting it fire off Stab, Surfs, and Earthquakes while only having to fear Grass types, which, while they're pretty common in Hoenn, can be easily handled by other team members. I could go on and on about Swampert and how much I love it, but if you want to see some examples of this Pokemon destroying Gen 3, go watch my Hardcore Emerald Nuzlocke that I released a while back. Swampert is the first starter we're looking at in this video to be ranked in the OU tier, and it's no joke in one of competitive Pokemon's most popular singles metagames. With an outstanding defensive typing, it's a great answer to strong offense like T-Tar, Metagross, and Aerodactyl, counters Salamence and Flygon with Ice Beam, and stifles electric types like Zapdos and Jolteon running Hidden Power Ice. It even has access to moves like Refresh and Roar to increase its longevity along with its sand immunity, boosted even further by Protect, which it uses both for extra leftovers recovery and to scatter dangerous attacks, like Hidden Power Grass that electric types run simply because it exists, or Explosion from Choice Band Metagross. Its solid special attack paired with Torrent boosting its water moves at low health helps it blast defensive cores with Hydro Pump, and Earthquake or even Focus Punch can be used to slam Blissey. However, its big drawback also comes from its typing, that being its quad weakness to Grass type attacks. While it's bulky enough to potentially live some Hidden Power Grass hits, it has no reliable recovery outside of leftovers, and it's walled entirely by Celebi, who can just use it as setup fodder. It also greatly struggles to break through Milotic and Suicune, the tier's other bulky waters, but while these and a few other factors prove to keep Swampert in check, it's still a presence that towers over Advanced OU, giving it a solid, respectable spot high in the A tier and shaping the meta as a whole. So it's time to score him again. First, Sceptile's in-game score rests at a 7 out of 10. None of these Pokemon are bad to have on your team at all, but Sceptile has too many alternatives that the only reasons you'd pick it are either that you like it, or you're doing some challenge like a Grass Monotype run. In competitive, it's a little lower at 6 out of 10, with some big drawbacks, but a respectable subseed set all the same. Blaziken sits a little higher, at an 8 out of 10 in-game, because it's quite possibly the best fire type you can get, and its amazing coverage and access to bulk up means that picking it over Swampert, while a little strange, is definitely understandable. In competitive though, it sits a little higher than Sceptile at a 7 out of 10. It's definitely usable, but it has some pretty big flaws. Its defenses are poor, and while it's a decent mixed attacker, you'd probably be better off using something like Moltres or Charizard as your fire type. Swampert, though, gets a solid 10 out of 10 in-game, and there's no question why. It beats so many things, and its stats are such a perfect mix of great defense and amazing offense, especially when paired with its outstanding typing. In competitive, it gets a 9.5 out of 10, just missing out on that perfect 10 because, while it's an amazing, highly respectable Pokemon that is undeniably shaped advanced OU, its quad weakness to grass and the lack of ability to break other bulky waters holds it back just enough from becoming an S tier like Tyranitar. Overall, ROC had some incredible starters, and while they're all amazing, Swampert takes the cake as one of the greatest starter Pokemon of all time. Well, that's about it for Ruby, Sapphire, and Emerald, but we're not quite done yet. Before the video ends, let's talk about Fire Red and Leaf Green and how the Kanto starters changed, both in the remakes and in Advance. First, Charizard isn't much better. It does now get Flying Stab, making it even better against Erica and letting it beat both the Fighting Dojo and Bruno's fighting types, at least when they don't live and hit a quad-effective Rock Tomb, but it still just doesn't match up well enough against a majority of the Pokemon in the region, and there are both better flying types in the Spearow and Dodrio, as well as Moltres being accessible much earlier due to being in the Sevi Islands instead of Victory Road, and Arcanine being a better fire type with Intimidate if you're playing Fire Red. So its score will stay at a 5 out of 10. While it got a couple of buffs, so did its fellow fire types, and its replacement Moltres is accessible earlier too, hurting Charizard's viability. However, while not much changed for it in-game, Advanced Charizard is a true, viable OU Pokemon as opposed to its NE ranking in RBY. While tough to use, when Belly-Drum Zard gets going, there isn't much that can stop it that's not named Suicune. If it utilizes Select Berry, Substitute, or a Baton Pass Agility, it outspeeds a lot and can hit really hard, and if it's paired with good teammates like Dugtrio or Magaton, it can be a very, very dangerous Pokemon. Simply put, Advanced Charizard is a high-risk, high-reward Pokemon that's finally managed to come out of Moltres' shadow to make a real name for itself. I'll give Charizard in Gen 3 a solid 8 out of 10 because, even with its flaws, it's surely earned its place in the high C tier. Blastoise is up next, and pretty much nothing has changed for it since RBY. Sure, it gained Turret and a special defense stat of 105, but it didn't really gain or lose many tools at all. In light of its buffs, it's still overshadowed by Tentacruel, Gyarados, and Starmie, the former of them getting Clear Body and Intimidate respectively, two great abilities that help them stand out from the Water-type starter. Pair this with the fact that Blizzard, quite possibly the best Ice-type option, was nerfed from having 90% accuracy to 70%, it's going to be falling from a 7 out of 10 to a 6.5 out of 10. In Advance OU, Blastoise was outclassed by the other bulky waters Suicune, Milotic, and Swampert, and even though it had Rapid Spin, Roar, and Haze to be a decent utility mon, it simply didn't have the use for serious play, so it fell to UU. There it's pretty useful as a sort of OU bulky water, but in UU, with a set of Surf, Ice Beam, Rest, and either Sleep Talk, Rapid Spin for spikes, or Toxic to counter Pokemon like Lantern that would switch in on it. It's an easy Pokemon to bring in against many teams, such as prevalent mons like Gligar, Solrock, or Sandslash, but its Sleep Talk isn't as useful because of the many sleepers that are Grass type, and can therefore do some big damage. Not the worst option for sure, and it gets a 6.5 out of 10. Last up, we again have Venusaur, and while it may have lost its busted Sleep, Growth, and the very crit-heavy Razor Leaf, it makes up for it in its newly revamped typing and great power. It still outclasses the likes of Vileplume and Victory Bell, and Leech Seed and later Synthesis can help you, especially if you're not using items in battle. It's incredible early game, helpful throughout the mid game, and while it falls off late game, it still has the tools to make an impact. Its score falls to a 9 out of 10 because, while it's still great and has synergy with your other likely teammates, it does lose a few of its more overpowered tools. Finally, in competitive, Venusaur falls right in the middle of its two counterparts, ending up in UUBL. It's in the high to mid D tier in terms of OU viability, but it still has good bulk, nice status moves, and the tools to cripple a wide range of the tier with the help of something to deal with Celebi and Blissey. With Sweet Powder and Leech Seed, it can wear down opposing Pokemon while being annoying with Sludge Bomb and Synthesis, though Sandstorm deals with it pretty well. Alternatively, it can go back to its roots in RBY and use a Sword Stance or Curse set, which, with support from Magneton to counter Skarmory, could be surprisingly effective. However, it has a lot of things to counter it, either by invalidating its status or simply shrugging off its attacks. Skarmory is only weak to Hidden Power Fire, Gyarados and Salamis eat up anything that throws at them besides a weird hidden power, and Celebi can take anything except Sludge Bomb. Venusaur can deal with all these threats individually with certain sets, but they're all too prevalent for that to be feasible. Unfortunately, Venusaur in Advanced OU manages to maintain its 5 out of 10 from RBY, but not anything else. So those are my rankings for the starter Pokemon in the first 3 generations. Gen 4 introduces quite a bit more to talk about, especially competitively with Little Cup and VGC. I'll likely be covering those, but comment down below what you guys think. Also, while you're down there, tell me what you think about my rankings. The first 3 generations aren't something I'm super experienced with competitively, but I know the games themselves, especially Advanced, pretty well. Make sure to like the video if you enjoyed it, and subscribe if you don't miss part 2, where I cover either Gens 4 through 6, or just 4 and 5 depending on how long it takes. Also join my Discord, the link for which is in the description, and follow me on Twitter where I'll post updates about the channel. This has been a super fun video, but it's just about over, so until next time, this is Shoot Kapow, over and out.